So I've had a couple requests lately about a boardwalk along a typical section. And while this isn't a section type that we have in Beyond Typicals, with some advanced work, including creating an asset in SketchUp and importing that asset into Beyond Typicals, plus some advanced techniques to get people walking on it, I hope to show you in this tutorial a good example of getting this into your model. This could also give you the tools to import in other repeating assets that might stretch along the length of your section with similar tools. So I've got this pre-built section. It's pretty simple. It's a 2-lane road with a pretty steep drop off on the right side. And I'm going to use this as the framework to put in a wood boardwalk on the right side behind this guardrail. So I'm going to load up SketchUp. And I'm going to draw in the inches model because that's how I'm going to enter in the different dimensions of various elements in SketchUp. You could draw in other units, but I want to highlight that when we go to export this model, we'll export it with a unit of centimeters, so it will convert and scale correctly when importing that file into Beyond Typicals. As I've mentioned in other videos, we recommend that aligning your green axis as the front edge of whatever you're modeling is best to bring an asset into Beyond Typicals, so I've rotated my view accordingly. Now I'm just going to start drawing pieces of the boardwalk, and I've done this a couple of times for practice, but I'm not an expert at SketchUp. I actually found a really helpful tutorial playlist on YouTube for SketchUp beginners that I'll link in the video description below, and thanks to Justin at the SketchUp Essentials for those really helpful videos. So I'm going to draw the various pieces of the boardwalk and start with this 9-foot by 8-inch rectangle, which will serve as a deck board component of the boardwalk. Then I can push this up to make it 2 inches thick. And now what I want to do is assign a wooden surface texture to this. So I'm first going to add a surface texture using one of SketchUp's preset colors. Let's use brown. It doesn't really matter, but you need to assign a surface texture in order to edit it, and use SketchUp's Use Texture Image tool to add an image as the surface texture, which will replace that color. I'm going to load in this plywood image that I downloaded from Polyhaven, which is a website where you can download free texture images. This plywood texture looked pretty nice, so I went and downloaded a 1K resolution. Anything higher is going to be unnecessary. And when downloading, I recommend getting the diffuse JPEG. So that's the image that we're working with here. So when I go and select that texture image, you'll see that that plywood texture has been applied to the surface. I can then right-click on this and go to Texture, Position, and then rotate the image so that it's patterned and aligned along that longer edge. There we go. And now I can use the eyedropper tool to select that texture and then apply it to all the sides of that board with the Paint Can tool. So we're going to create this single deck board component, and then we're going to copy it out to a length of 10 feet. I don't need to create the entire length of a boardwalk. All I really need to do is create a repeatable segment that I can then assign to a section. That's similar to how our fencing and guardrail section types work in Beyond Typicals. You can see this section has a guardrail 2 asset, which repeats on only an 8-foot spacing. So in SketchUp, I'm going to make a 10-foot long segment of this boardwalk, which I'll add into this fill slope and have it repeat every 10 feet, similarly to that section with the guardrail. Now that I have this single deck board, I'm going to select it and then right-click and make it a component. That's a nice feature where if we copy this a bunch of times and then need to edit the length or the width of that board, they'll all update at the same time. And before I copy it, I first want to lay out a tape measure line. This is a temporary construction line in SketchUp that you can place. I'm going to make this 9 feet, 11.5 inches. And I'm not going to go a full 10 so that I have a little bit of gap between the first and last deck boards when this asset repeats in Beyond Typicals. Now, SketchUp has a really nice copy tool for things like this. First, I'll use the Move command and choose the base point where I want to copy from. Then I tap Control on my keyboard to change it from Move to Copy mode. Then I can click to snap that corner to the end of my tape measure. Before I do anything else, I can type divide or slash to make multiple copies. And you can see this in the bottom right. So let's try divide and 10. And you'll see that 10 equally spaced copies of that deck board are then placed. I want to space this a little closer. So again, before clicking or do anything else, I can type divide by 14. That's too close. So let's do 13. There we go. So we've got that deck board copied 13 times. It's on that tape measure length with equal spacing. So it's just a really convenient way to use that copy tool. So I'll speed this up and spend some time building out the rest of this deck segment, including some substructure elements and railings using that same methodology. There we have it. There is the 10-foot long segment with the deck boards. The substructure is basically 10-foot long side joists and posts, which will repeat every 10 feet. And then I've got 10-foot long railings with rail posts that will be spaced every 5 feet. So again, I'm just looking to create the single repeatable segment of the boardwalk that is a set length here in SketchUp so that I can import it into Beyond Typicals and space it out at that set length. I can also use that SketchUp copy tool here to preview what that would look like. So I can select everything and then go to copy this by tapping Control, and then I can move this out to 10 feet. And now I can use a function similar to how I divided those deck boards, but instead multiply it. So I can say X, and let's do 10. So now I can see that boardwalk segment copied out 10 times at 10-foot intervals. I'm going to undo that and return to my individual segment of boardwalk. And first I will save this SketchUp file. So let's go to File, Save As, and I'm going to create a new subfolder called Boardwalk Wood on my computer to save this SketchUp file there. Now that that's saved, I can export this file to an OBJ, which will be the file type that we want to import into Beyond Typicals. So I'm going to navigate back to that subfolder where I saved the SketchUp file and make sure it's saving as an OBJ file, and then click Options. As we've explained in another tutorial video about importing assets from SketchUp, these options are what you'll need to set to bring the file in correctly. So we want to make sure to export texture mapping, which will bring in this plywood texture along with it. And we want to set the scale units to centimeters. That's important for importing into Beyond Typicals so that it scales to the right size as expected. So I can press OK and click Export and get the confirmation that that has been exported. Before we jump into Beyond Typicals, I'm going to head to that folder where I exported that file and show you those output versions. So we've got the SketchUp file where we modeled that 3D object. That's where I saved it. We've also got our OBJ file, which is that export from SketchUp. This also comes with an MTL file. This is the file that basically maps the image onto those various surfaces. So this is important for being able to show those textures as they're imported into Beyond Typicals. And we've also got a subfolder which contains that texture. So I use that plywood. This is now stored alongside the MTL and the OBJ. All of these are important for being able to see those textures when you bring it into Beyond Typicals. I just wanted to point that out where sometimes if you were to export an OBJ and create a Beyond Typicals model with that if you sent that BTIP file to somebody else and they opened it up, it's going to look for that same location for the MTL and the image. And if those aren't in the exact same place, then it's very possible that that object might come in as a plain white object when they open the file. If that's the case, what you can do is basically hand to that user all of these, and they can re-import this and replace that imported asset themselves to be able to see it. But moving back into Beyond Typicals, I basically want to add that object to this fill slope, which I've got as 10 feet wide. I want to add that as a repeating asset, similar to how we have that guardrail applied to this gravel shoulder. So to do that, I want to go import that asset we just created. So I can do that by going to Assets and then the Imported Asset tab at the top here. Then I click Import New. That's going to load a dialog box to go navigate and find that object. By default, this looks for FBX files, but I can change that to look for OBJs and navigate to that folder where I created that OBJ file. So I can open that and finish the import. And now I have that asset, which is now a placeable object in the software. I don't want to place this a bunch of different times. What I want to do is assign this as a primary asset to this fill slope 5 so that it repeats down the length of the section. So I have control over spacing and rotation and things like that, similar to this guardrail here. In order to bring that boardwalk asset into this drop-down list for primary assets, like any other asset, all you need to do is click on the asset thumbnail and it will bring up a list of all the different section types in Beyond Typicals. So here, by toggling any of these on, it's going to make this boardwalk as an asset choice for the drop-down list in primary or secondary asset. So I can toggle on fill slope 5, and now when I click on that fill slope 5, you'll see that this boardwalk is now an option to choose as a primary asset. There we go. So by default, it comes in at maybe an unpredictable spacing and rotation. There might be some defaults there that need to be adjusted. So what I'm going to do is move this out to a 10-foot spacing, and I can play around with the horizontal offset and longitudinal offset and rotation and things like that. So let's make sure everything is rotated into place and moved to a middle offset, and I can actually lower this and move it a little bit forward or back as well. So let's adjust those settings. So there we go. We've got our boardwalk in alongside the road. If you're looking just for a static render, it's very easy to just drop in a few static pedestrians on here. Otherwise, if you did want to see animated traffic down the length of this boardwalk, that's going to be a more complicated workflow, but not impossible. My thought here is what we basically need to do is create a walking surface with walking pedestrian assets. And to do that, we can actually pull in a couple of sidewalk sections and turn them transparent. And I'll show you this workflow. What I'm going to do is actually pull in 2 different sidewalk sections, so we'll duplicate that. This is just to get 2 lanes of moving traffic along the length of that section. And then I can head to Advanced Texturing and change this to transparent. And if I unlock texturing, I can start turning all of these elements down below that surface as transparent. So we've basically just got walking pedestrians over the top of an invisible substructure. What we can then do is add that boardwalk along this sidewalk section instead of the fill slope, and then use our earth layers to fill in a wedge of earth underneath where that boardwalk is going to be, so it's not just a steep drop off there. So I'm going to delete this section, this fill slope. Now we've replaced it with the pedestrians. Let's go and add the boardwalk that we created. Let's clear this asset filter. Go back to our boardwalk asset and add sidewalk to the list of sections where we want to see that boardwalk as an option. Here we've got the walking pedestrian as the primary asset, so we'll add the boardwalk as the secondary asset. And again, we may need to adjust spacing and rotation. And here I want to make sure that the pedestrians are actually walking on the surface, so I can try to get that vertical offset just fine-tuned to the bottom of their feet. That looks pretty good. If I need to see that moved forward, again, you can adjust the longitudinal offset. We can also play a little bit with spacing and scaling if you do want to see this maybe just at the surface of the front of the section. So what I can do is actually play around with the x-axis scaling, the y-axis scaling, just to make that a little bit longer. And in that case, we might want to adjust our spacing accordingly as well. So what I've done is just basically made that 10-foot section a little bit longer, 12.5 feet or so. So let's type in 12.5. Actually, might need a little bit more of a gap between those. There we go. So 12.75 seems to work. And now we've got the pedestrians kind of walking to the front of the section and hitting the actual front of that boardwalk and not kind of hovering in space for a couple of feet. So now all that's left is to fill in the dirt below this. This is going to use our advanced section called Earth Layers. So I'm going to scroll down toward the bottom of our section list and find Earth Layers. If you haven't used this before, this is basically a section type that gives you control over a size and shape of a certain material, kind of independent of the actual section width. So I've got this earth layer section. By default, it's 4 feet, but regardless of what I make that section width, that piece of earth is going to be controllable, similar to our bridge substructures or our water planes or our underground pipes, where you can kind of move these around and scale them into place. So what I'm going to do is take that earth layer and let's make that width 0 feet, so there's no gap between this slope and the sidewalk sections here. And now I can head to that earth sections menu here and start adjusting this gravel piece that's the default to a wedge of earth. So in the pull down list, I can go find sloped earth. Let's do sloped earth 4 by 8. That gives us a wedge that's pretty close to that shape. I'm going to try to move that into place. So we'll move the X position and the Y position. And now what we can use is our scale tools. I can unlink the scale to make sure that I can adjust X and Y scale disproportionately, just to size that into place. So let's give that a shot. All right, that looks pretty good. If I scale the Y up any farther, you see that this won't quite match those two edges. So I'm going to leave that at 1.3, and that's just going to leave me with some gap here. But with that earth section menu, I can just get another piece of earth here and go find that and move that into place and scale that so that it fills up that gap at the bottom. There we go. The last thing I'll do here is just adjust these labels. I don't want those 5-foot sidewalk labels, so what I can do is turn off the labels for one of those, and we'll change this label here for this sidewalk on the right to say Boardwalk. And we can override the dimension to say 10 feet. And so now we can move that into place so it lines up with the common lane labels as well. If you wanted to see those vertical leaders, I've mentioned this in a video as well. We've got this earth layer section here. It's got a vertical leader line. We can just use that similar to our invisible sections, where I move that label height up just to match the other vertical leader stems. And I can also put an invisible section here on the right side of this and make that 0 feet wide and move the label height of that 0 foot wide invisible section so that its vertical leader also extends upwards to match the other labels in the section. So there we go. Using SketchUp and imported assets and some advanced sections like earth layers, we can create a boardwalk with people walking along your model in Beyond Typicals. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out via email at brian@beyondware.com or leave a comment. Thanks for watching.